I felt a greater awareness and conversation around like biohacking and longevity trends, especially when it comes to wearables and also to lab data that is now being democratized and made cheaper. Like people mentioned that company Function Health multiple times to me in personal conversations, and it was talked about in my panel, and I believe in some others. Um, that's a company, for those that don't know, where you can get a bunch of labs done for supposedly a lot cheaper than, if you had to go through your doctor or you went through the lab directly. Um, but I think there's a really interesting tie between that democratization and the cheapening of those labs, these wearables becoming more abundant and less expensive, AI becoming more like in wellness and health and using that data to make recommendations or give you information, and then nutrient density and regen. And it's like, what's the confluence of all that going to be? The super glass half full, we want regen to succeed, we're very biased take on that would probably be, all this data is going to proliferate and people are going to make healthier decisions. That is ultimately going to be undoubtedly regen when we have the data to say you should be eating more of this, that, or the other thing. But I think there's also a way where it could totally go awry. So just super interesting to watch. And I don't know exactly what I think is going to happen, but I feel the like next year or the year after, it's going to be really like the point of conversation, because all that biological research mixed with AI is going to explode, I think, in the next 12, 24, 36 months.
I totally agree with everything you just said, and I'm really glad that you tied it back to nutrient density as sort of this thing that we've been discussing for a few years now. I'm not saying we're the first or the only ones to be focusing on that term or that quality or that attribute or however you want to label it, but I think that was another one of those trends that shows itself, manifests itself in different ways in different places. And I think on stage in particular with some of the panels, it was very present. And then if you look at how brands are talking about their attributes, it was sort of like subliminally present. So I'm excited to see the natural products industry focusing more on that. And to your point, I think there is a world that bodes very, very well for regenerative agriculture. Of course, there's the other potential where the Sygentas and the Bayers of the world figure out how to create new pesticides, herbicides, some kind of spray that increase nutrient density and is still detrimental for soil health. Like that reality is possible. It feels really expensive and further away than improving our farming practices and implementing regenerative practices. So I'm hoping, as we all are probably listening here, that the continual focus on nutrient density improves the conversion rates for regenerative practices on arable land.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything you said. I think they're interesting things to watch. I think there's two things that I'm thinking about or questioning or asking or looking to the future is like, where does bioavailability play into all of this? Because it's one thing to have the nutrient density, but if it's not bioavailable based on the way you're delivering it or processing it, or just because of some natural limitation of said product, ingredient, et cetera, then it's like, it's basically having great gas, but no car to like drive around. So, I'm super interested to see how that plays into, especially the wearables. And are we headed to a world where you have a wearable that's going to tell you the bioavailability, right? So something maybe has less nutrient density, but it's more bioavailable. So it's actually the thing that you should eat. And then is there a way for brands, products, et cetera, to kind of game the system and turn those not from a objective fact-based kind of source of recommendations to like a Yelp, like you're going to show up first because we paid you 10 grand or whatever. So I don't know. That's one thing that I'm thinking of. And then, from an industry change perspective and a net gain of consumer demand increase for regenerative, like, is all of this just optimization of the existing healthy eating crowd where the demands on the people already doing good are just going to get harder and we're just optimizing the amount of healthy food that's already being eaten? Or are we going to have a net sea change increase in the amount of healthy food being eaten? Like that to me is a question that I don't really know. So those are the two things that I'm kind of pondering or sitting with.
Yeah, I think to your latter point, I think both will end up happening at the same time. To what degree, I don't know. But especially the Maha movement does make me feel like there are more pantries today where people are concerned about what they're putting into their households and into their bodies than ever before, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I really loved your question on the bioavailability piece, because when talking with Eric from Audacious and some of these other nutrient density companies that are really focusing on some of the testing, it makes me realize how much work remains to be done, not just in baselining quote nutrient density standards for specific commodity types. We'll go back to bananas. Like how much of XYZ nutrients should be in a regular banana, and how much of an increase do we see in regenerative bananas? That has to happen for the entire food system in a raw capacity. And the bioavailability question makes me think about, will there become a day of reckoning for processing? Because if you think about our industrial methods producing food in the United States, it's really like, this is going to be a huge oversimplification, but it's twofold. Commodity crops grow as big and as fast as possible, and then put them into formats where they can have the longest amount of shelf stability to reduce potential risk and liability of food spoilage. Right. So will there become a day where we get to do that same level of nutrient density testing post food processing? And what will that prove? And it kind of, for me, harkens back immediately to grains and flours and like what feels kind of like the reproliferation of stone ground in many different categories, which I think is fantastic. And maybe that category is a little bit ahead of the curve. And I'm just curious to see how that plays out in all these other categories.